Then today we are working on our compliance rules. We're going to discuss them, and that covers the rules 300, 301, 310, and 320. My apologies. In our last few workshops, we have been using the raise your hand function and the chat box throughout the workshop to pose questions. We'd like to continue to do that and encourage people to jump right on in as well when no one has their hand raised or no one's speaking. The raise your hand function and the chat box function can be found by going to the bottom of your window and clicking on the participant panel. Participant panel will have the mute and unmute button, as well as the raise your hand function next to the mute and unmute button. You should also find the chat box function there, but you will not want to click on that one because that will send messages up to participants in their private chat boxes. What you'll want to do is go back to the bottom of your window and you'll find the little text bubble with, the little icon with the chat bubble in it. You'll click on that and that will open the chat box. Please send your comments to everyone so that we can see those comments. Do not send your comments directly to Glenn because he will not be able to see them. Commerce staff will get to the questions in the chat box during our question and answer times. What is put in the chat box is recorded, so we will keep those comments after the workshop as well. With that, I believe I'll turn it over to Glenn.
Well, thank you, Austin. This is Glenn Blackman from the Department of Commerce, and we're here for our who knows which workshop for implementation of rules about the Clean Energy Transformation Act. I want to thank everybody for coming back again to help us with this project. It's been an unusual process for all of us, and I really appreciate everybody's willingness to do their best with the circumstances and help us get to the conclusion of this rulemaking work so that we can then set about actually implementing the law on behalf of the people of Washington. And today's workshop is intended to cover three areas of the rule where the legislature didn't necessarily reach crystal clear language about what the what's required under the standards. That we can talk kind of. Hey, Rob Campbell from PowerX. They want to mute. We're getting some incidental conversation.
Absolutely.
From there. Thanks. Anyway, so these three rules are I sometimes refer to them as compliance rules because they address questions about what it means to comply with a particular provision in the statute. And all three of these are ones that we had a first really good discussion of the statutory language way back in October, if you remember that workshop that we had in Wenatchee, Washington. We covered these three topics there, and we got some written comment in November of last year that was really helpful in kind of working through the issues. And so I would say that my hopes for this workshop are a little bit different from the one that we did a couple of weeks ago, where stakeholders were, seeing planning language that, it was more of a first impression for people to see that language. And we were hoping through that workshop to explain kind of what we were intending to do with the draft language and answer questions and kind of clarify that in order to help make the written comments that will follow in June, be more on target. And with these rules today, I feel like we're a step beyond that, and that we're able to look at language today that reflects our best effort to learn from the discussion last fall and the written comments to move things closer to kind of where they need to be for kind of the final version of the language. And that's not to say that I think we're done with these, but I do feel like they are more well vetted through earlier workshop process and some of the others that we've talked about so far. So with that kind of background, I guess it's time to start looking at actual rule language. And so the first one in the set today is number is 194.40.300. If anybody's not able to see the screen on the web platform, this language is also available on our website, commerce.wa.gov/CETA. Look for the first discussion draft of the rules, and that's the overall package. And then the rule 300 is the one that we're discussing first. And what I wanted to do was provide some context for this by starting with the language in the statute that we're working with. And so the immediate context in the statute is RCW 19.405.030, which says that after 2025, utilities can no longer include coal-fired resources in their allocation of electricity for Washington retail load. But the key part of that is actually in the definitions. So I've got the definitions here for our reference. And one of those definitions is allocation of electricity. It's the costs and benefits associated with the resources that are used to provide electricity to the utilities' retail electricity customers in Washington. And then the second definition, the one that I think we'll spend more time on today, is of a coal-fired resource. And it starts with kind of what we would probably all think of as what coal-fired resource means, and that's a facility that uses coal-fired generating units in whole or in part, that are fired in whole or in part by coal to generate electricity. And then there are a couple of exclusions from that. So, in the rule, when we're talking about what you have to do with respect to coal-fired resources, we're going to be attempting to follow this exclusion that's there in subsection B, subsection small Roman 1 or I, and that it does not include electricity, or does not include an electric generating facility that's part of a limited duration wholesale power purchase not to exceed 1 month made by an electric utility for delivery to retail electric customers in Washington, for which the source of the power is not known at the time of entry into the transaction to procure the electricity. There's a second exemption or exception that I'm not planning to cover today. If anybody feels like we need a rule on that, then please let us know. But for the moment, at least, we would just let that part of the definition stand on its own. And I want to make sure people understand that when we are writing the rules, you know, it's kind of like way up at the top of the chapter of the rules. It says that all the definitions that are in the statute itself, in CETA, are used in the rules too. So even though in our rules we don't restate these definitions, these are the ones that are applied when we're looking at terms that are in the rule itself. So now let's go up to the draft language itself. And kind of the basic question that we're presented with is, you know, how do you document a negative? You know, if you're required not to use coal-fired resources, how do you show that you did not do something? And you know, there have been discussions in the past about you know, an audit that might cover you know, every transaction that the utility engaged in over the course of the year and things like that. And while that for some things might be, you know, an appropriate level of effort to take, it seemed that a reasonable approach with this particular standard is one where the utility itself makes an attestation that it did not include coal-fired resources in its allocation of electricity for Washington retail load. One reason why we think that that's a reasonable approach to it is that, you know, for the most part, the big examples would be, you know, like if a utility owned a coal-fired resource or they had a long-term contract, you know, like for the entire output of a coal plant or something like that. Things that would be pretty obvious and you know, would be easily detected, and that instead, you know, this is really more about the ordinary operations of the utility, the practices that it has for entering into contracts to purchase power, and that business practice that avoids the inclusion of coal-fired resources in Washington. Service to Washington loads would be the right level of demonstration. And so the attestation is what was proposed. And it seemed to have, there was a general consensus that, at least broadly speaking, that would be an appropriate way to do it. We talked about this in October. And then subsection 2 of the rule essentially restates the exception for resources that are purchased for a term of 1 month or less. And so subsection 2 essentially carries forward that provision in the definition, and to make sure that people understand that an attestation can be made about that you didn't use coal-fired resources, even if there were short-term contracts that were unspecified sources. And so for the short-term contracts, if the source is not specified, you might say, well, I can't be sure that that didn't come from a coal-fired resource because it's unspecified, and I don't know for sure. But since it's been short-term unspecified contract has been excluded from the definition, and subsection 2 is saying that it's okay to go ahead and make that attestation because those are not included in the definition of a coal-fired resource. And then that gets us to what I think is the thornier part of this issue, and that has to do with contracts that aren't covered by that exception and are not known to be from a coal-fired resource. So these would be, again, unspecified contracts, unspecified source contracts or purchases, and they're for a duration of more than 1 month. And as we understand the rule, as we understand the statute and the definition, those are not covered by the 1 month exception. They don't benefit from that provision that, well, I don't know what the source is, so it's okay for me to essentially treat it as if it were not coal. And so that leaves us with that it seems under the statute that if one doesn't know the source and the utility is required not to use coal, that the statute requires that we assume that it is from coal unless that possibility can be ruled out. Obviously, the best way to rule out that possibility is for the contract to identify the source of the electricity and for that source not to be from a coal-fired plant. And there's no question about whether it can be included in the Washington rates. There's no question about whether the utility has, with that contract, complied with the no coal requirement, section 030. And the discussion that we have had since then has been that, at least in some instances, utilities have had a practice of entering into contracts that are for a duration of more than 30 days or more than 1 month, and where the contract has not identified the source. And so, we didn't feel like we could in any way just kind of give some sort of a new exception to cover those and say that those don't need to be considered as a coal-fired resource. So in subsection 3, what we offered instead was an opportunity for the utility to find another way other than the terms of the contract itself to establish that electricity did not come from a coal-fired generating plant. And the one concrete example of that potential source of a demonstration there would be the electronic tags or the NERC e-tags that might provide evidence to show that when the electricity was scheduled for transmission and delivery over the grid, the utility may be able to show that it did not come from a coal plant, and therefore they could still safely make that attestation that that the power did not come from a coal-fired resource. So there's the recap on the rule, and I would open it up for comment about this approach overall and whether we think there's an opportunity, this seems like a reasonable way of dealing with the issues presented with this rule.
Hi, Glenn. We had one comment from John Rothwin in the chat box. It says, would a utility's participation in an EIM be captured under subsection 3 as acquiring electricity for Washington retail load for a term greater than 1 month?
My understanding of the EIM is that those are contracts for very short durations of power, well under a month in duration. And I wouldn't expect that, a utility's decision to enter the EIM or to participate in it, that's not the contract that we would be talking about here. It would be the actual transaction themselves, that I'm going to buy power for the next 15 minutes through the EIM. I think that's exactly the sort of thing that was meant to be covered under subsection 2. If in the EIM time you procure that power, the source is not known, that's okay in terms of making the demonstration that you're not using coal-fired resources.
Thanks, Glenn. And we have Kent Lopez with his hand raised. Kent, will you unmute?
Yeah, thanks. So Glenn, I'm looking at sub 1 here, and you are asking for the attestation by the chief executive officer of the utility. I'm wondering if we could maybe get into some trouble down the road, because a lot of the electric cooperatives, for instance, do not designate their chief operating officer as the chief executive officer. They're general managers and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if you'd be open to language that's allowed for the attestation by a official designated by the governing body, or some language like that that would allow somebody other than a quote chief executive officer to make the attestation in the case of a utility that doesn't have a CEO.
We're definitely open to suggestions around that, Kent. And I also would an attestation by the governing body itself be a possibility that we should consider too, like maybe a resolution that they adopt?
Yeah,
I'm open to either direction. So
yeah, I'm just nervous that if this is the actual rule that gets out there, and then a co-op makes an attestation and somebody comes back and says, well, that's not a legal attestation because it requires a chief executive officer and it was made by the general manager or the chairman of the board or something like that. So maybe just a little flexibility in who's designated to make that attestation would be helpful.
That sounds like a good idea. And in fact, I think when we get down to another rule, we have less specific term that we've used there. So maybe the answer is already in front of us, in terms of how to do that. But we're definitely open to that that sort of a adjustment to the language.
Then we have Tatiana Winger, who had her hand raised next. Tatiana.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Good morning.
Hi, nice to see you and excited to work the shop or whatever it was you said.
Or was it shop the work? I can't remember.
Shop the work, yeah. So I think, Mike, I want to comment on subsection 3. And I think you said this is a thorny issue, and we agree. I've been surveying some utilities to see what exact kind of information is included in e-tags. And sometimes a source is a specific generating resource, but often it's just a system. And so, that's one issue that we see potentially with the use of e-tags. And I know you said it's hard to document a negative. What exactly do you do for that? I think it is kind of hard, because even if e-tags do indicate a resource, my understanding of e-tags is that they generally describe a scheduling path that might not actually be true to the actual flow of what gets into the actual system for that that utility. I'm not describing that super well, but it might not actually align with reality. And so that's another thing that we've thought about when we've thought about the use of e-tags. And generally, we think that this provision could have real market impacts, both on the purchasing of electricity, which is the intention of the law, right? And we understand that and recognize that, but also there could just be general market impacts on selling resources, and it just seems like it's a pretty big issue. And so one thing that we've thought about is we've looked at the carbon and electricity market stakeholder work group from 19.405130, and it looks like they're supposed to inform rulemaking to establish specification, verification, and reporting requirements for load met with market purchases. And I think they're looking at a process where they're taking time with several hours of workshops and looking really in depth at issues. And so because this is such an important one and could have such impacts, I think we would hope to see this issue brought up in that markets work group and see what kind of ideas they come up with for a good way to document what the best approach is for this issue. And so I guess that would be our question is around that markets work group and whether that's the best forum to investigate this issue, because we think it is a pretty big one.
I'll look forward to other people's thoughts on both of those points. The one that maybe e-tags aren't actually a kind of a backstop option that's worth anything, which if we were to remove that such as phrase from subsection 3, is there anything left, I guess would be the question. Is there any other operational data the utility might rely on to demonstrate the electricity was not generated using coal? So seems like there are I've seen other people with interest in using e-tags for some documentation of CETA type requirements, and so I hope to get some discussion on that. As far as the markets work group, my vision of their work is that it deals with organized markets and how to work with revise processes in a way that utilities can participate in organized markets. And for the most part, I don't see these multi-month purchases of power from unspecified sources as very closely related to those issues around organized markets. However, if that markets work group ends up producing a better way of doing this, we would be very happy to look at incorporating it into this Rule 300 at that time. And anytime between now and 2025 would be open to that possibility.
Hi, Glenn. This is Austin. Ben Farrow had a similar comment about the relationship between this work and the markets work group, and I think you just asked that, but I wanted to recognize Ben's comment. I believe Sandy Edgman was next.
Hi, good morning, Glenn, and the rest of
Sandy.
the fellow rule makers. It's great to be with you again today. So I had written in the chat that I agree with John DeVore's comment about suggested wording about making the chief executive officer term, changing it to utility senior executive or official or governing board. Personally, the city of Richland sees the attestation as an administrative function and not something that we would normally request our city council to approve. So it sounds like Commerce is open to that change in wording. The other question I have is the having to attest to it on an annual basis, and is there a way to attest to it, like in conjunction with our reporting and our updates, maybe on a biennial basis? And was curious what the annual reporting would achieve, rather than something that's aligned with our biennial updates.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we could look at. And again, if other people have thoughts on that, it's a requirement that may not, well, it probably wouldn't be hard to align it with the 4-year periods that are used in CETA, otherwise. So yeah, if there are thoughts on whether attestation should cover a longer period, maybe the same period that's covered by the CEIPs and things like that, we'd like to hear thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the next group to raise their hand was PNGC Power. If you would like to unmute and pose your question.
Hey, this is Greg at PNGC. Sorry, I don't know why my company popped up instead of my name on the WebEx, but it's Greg. Hey, Glenn. Hey, I had a concern about this section as it pertains to Bonneville Power customers, and just trying to think about the subsection 3 you put in there for being able to rely on operational data to demonstrate it was that electricity was not generated using coal as a fuel source. So I'm trying to think of a Bonneville customer's perspective on being able to get that done, and the complexities perhaps around Bonneville being able to provide its customers enough information, whether it be operationally or otherwise, to make that attestation comfortably. And I think it's a complex issue. I think we probably need some more thought around it, because when these contracts were signed back in 2008, I would say nobody knew exactly where the source of the purchase was going to come from for 100% of their requirements. And so the BPA contract, I think, certainly falls under a long-term contract, certainly more than a month, that we didn't know exactly where the energy was coming from. And so I don't think it's necessarily precluded from this group that you're capturing here. But for a Washington BPA customer, I just have a concern that BPA is not going to be able to specifically provide enough information for a customer to comfortably attest that nothing for any period of time was coming from a coal-fired resource. And it goes down to operational data for load following customers such as P&GC's members. They don't have an individual E-tag going to each utility. It's an aggregate of all of the load in the BPA footprint. And so trying to parse out what went where and who used what for a balancing purchase that BPA may acquire from the market for longer than a month, that seems like it will be multiple layers of issues that could potentially cause some concern around providing that attestation. So I just want to flag that as something that I'm thinking about, and perhaps additional language specifically addressing utilities who maybe don't necessarily have the ultimate control over what's being purchased, like Bonneville customers, needs to be added or thought about.
Thanks, Greg. And that, I think those are important points to think more about. That fact that the utilities contract with Bonneville is itself a contract of more than 1 month's duration is something for us to keep in mind. And then the other issue that I heard in your comment was about what would happen if Bonneville acquires power from an unspecified source that's more than 1 month in duration. How would that affect the utility that is Bonneville's customer? So I agree, those are things we need to look at further.
All right, Glenn, we've got a few more hands raised here, and we've got a number of comments in the chat box. So I'm going to request that we'd scheduled another 5 minutes for this section. So I'm going to request that we go through the people with their hands raised, and if you have something to add, or if you want to further a comment that's been made, please make it quick, and then we'll go to the comment box and wrap up the section. So we have Michelle Patterson. No, Michelle does not have her hand raised.
I did at one moment. I was going to say the same thing that Greg from P&GC just talked about, and I was going to punt it to you, Glenn, and just ask, how would a customer of Bonneville, provide that proof, if you will, of how much of Bonneville's unspecified resources were from purchases that were for more than a month. I think that would be a difficult task for each BPA customer. So it was in line with Greg's comments. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And then we have someone on the line with the username P37455 with their hand raised. If you'd like to unraise your hand and unmute yourself.
Was that Greg? He was on separately. Maybe not. Maybe it's somebody else.
Yeah, it seems that they do not have a mic hooked up, so maybe they can work on that or submit their comment. Then we have Lisa Rennie. Her hand raised. Lisa, would you like?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Glenn.
Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning. I wanted to just go back to what I think I heard you say, and this is in respect to the work of the markets work group, that, and I think this really pertains to 3. If the markets group came up with a better methodology for addressing market purchases or market activity in organized markets greater than 1 month, that, you know, perhaps Commerce would come back before 2025 and make some revisions. I think that's what you said. Correct me if I'm wrong. I appreciate the willingness to revisit based on what the work group may do, but I wanted to, I actually feel like sub 3 should be delayed. And the reason for that really, I think, is in RCW 19405-130 sub 3, where it says the department and the commission must adopt rules by June 30th, 2022, defining requirements, including appropriate specification, verification, and reporting requirements for the following. And that includes retail electric load met with market purchases. And then it cites RCW 19405-030, which is what we're discussing right now, the documenting coal-fired resources, as well as the greenhouse gas neutral and 100% compliance period. So I really feel statutorily that language points to the fact that really the markets work group would have a role in providing more guidance to Commerce and the Commission on retail electric load met with market purchases, as we might envision under the draft Rule 3.
So your proposal would be to adopt the rule without the subsection 3 included.
I think, well, I guess, yeah, I'm off mute. I would delay on 3, I think, until the work group has finished its when it's just getting started, finished its work, and both the UTC have that information before moving forward with maybe this section 194.40.30, but specifically sub 3. And not have to come back, you know, before 2025, but try to get it done within the timeline that's laid out, which is currently June 30th, 2022, possibly sooner.
All right, thanks.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. This is Jessica Zano with Pacificor. I had my hand raised a bit ago, but wasn't able to figure it out. I just wanted to support. Good morning. Hi, Glenn.
Hey.
We just wanted to support kind of the thoughts of PGP and others so far, that we think this is definitely an issue that is best served and addressed in the markets work group. For kind of a myriad of complicated reasons that I don't want to take too much time to get into, but essentially even purchases and transactions of terms greater than a month when we get into that real-time time frame, there is a divorced, we're divorced from that concept of what's actually happening versus, what the contract says. And that's one of kind of a host of issues. But and then quickly to kind of Wendy Gerlitz's question about how it impacts market prices is, the market work group will really delve into that. But I think, what you see is if you have to evidence something on a very granular basis, what will happen is that the region, everyone will hold on to certain resources versus distributing kind of, the socialized benefits of all the resources across the region. They'll hold on to those resources, and that causes a scarcity and a kind of a really balkanized kind of market. At a really high level, I think that's kind of how we see it. But we support the thoughts of other folks so far that we think that even subsection 3 could be interpreted to read may use e-tags, but don't necessarily have to use e-tags, and then an attestation could apply also for those market purchases. And if that was the case, then we would support the rules in their form. But we think that any kind of operational approach to evidencing or demonstrating compliance for those purchases should be deferred to the market work group. Thank you very much.
Okay, great, thanks.
Hey, Glenn.
Wendy, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thanks. I've had my hand raised for a while too. Sorry. I wanted to clarify, I think the last speaker addressed something that was in my comment. I wanted to clarify what my comment was intending to convey, which is, first of all, I want to express support for and I think we interpret it exactly the way the last speaker was interpreting it, which is electronic tags are an example of something the utility could use, but it's not required that they use electronic tags. So we read 3 as providing enough flexibility that if a utility or the markets work group sometime down the road or somebody else figures out a superior way to document what's being purchased and attest to this, provide documentation attesting to this that's superior to e-tags, that 3 is written flexibly enough to allow that to already occur. So we would support that language as written. And then my comment regarding, I think there's a distinction between on the market impacts. I feel like the statute is very clear what it's requiring. And it may well be that the statute has some market impacts. I think that's yet to be seen. But that's distinct from requiring utilities to demonstrate that they are complying with the statute. And what I was saying is I'm not convinced that how we structure the demonstration of compliance is necessarily the part of this that's affecting market prices. So I just think there's a distinction there, and we should be talking in clear terms about where the market impacts are coming from. The statute's clear what utilities have to do, and to require them to demonstrate compliance is not unreasonable. So again, we support the rule as written.
And I guess I'll just offer one more comment on the markets work group, because I do see a number of utilities saying that they'd like to see this issue deferred to that. My view of a successful or productive way that the markets work group might help with this problem would be if it identified a way to avoid the situation. In other words, to avoid this outcome where you have a contract for power more than 1 month in duration, where in the contract it doesn't identify the source. And if the markets work group is able to address that contract situation, then that doesn't need to be reflected in a rule, because in that case, it would no longer be a coal-fired resource. It would be a resource whose, a contract whose source is known and known not to be coal, and therefore no subsection 3 provision is needed for that circumstance. So anyway, that would be my challenge to those of you who are affiliated with anybody on the markets work group. If you want to take up this particular problem, try to figure out a way to make the sources known. Thank you.
Hi, Glenn. Though we have one more person who's had their hand raised for a while, Tom Barnard. Tom, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Tom. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Tom Barnard, State Auditor's Office, consumer-owned utility. We'll be auditing the consumer-owned utilities for compliance in this area. I just want to contribute to the conversation. The way I kind of auditors would look at this is, approaching the utility. What is your process? What is the utility's process for identifying all these contracts greater than a month that they entered into during the year? And of those, that were unspecified, it's the utility's purview to figure out what support it would need, or it could make available to demonstrate that they were not from coal-fired resources or something along that order. So limiting it to operational data, electronic tags, I think if a utility can figure out some other way of competently supporting the fact that it's not coal-fired, that would be typically something we would accept during the course of an audit. So I don't know how much that helps, or if that makes things easier, but that's kind of the thoughts going through my head as I was listening.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Hey, do you have any feedback, initial thoughts on this question about having this attestation occur on an annual basis versus, say, for example, a 4-year basis?
Yeah, I just if on a 4-year basis, would the feedback loop be enough for the users? The Act does say it's an annual requirement that annually this is going to happen, and in my mind, it was like, okay, is this something that we can check every year and just issue something that says, okay, annually this requirement was met by these utilities? And could that be performed as part of maybe our other auditing of those the utilities or the entities that are selling electricity? So anyways, those are the thoughts I was having, but I didn't see this as being a huge exhaustive effort. It was just something that was go in and is included in the scope, issue a separate report so it's identifiable to the users who are interested in 19405, and that was kind of the thought there.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, you bet.
Austin, do we need to move along here?
We do. I want to just recognize quickly, we had a handful of comments that backed a change in the Chief Executive Officer language in subsection 1. We also had a number of comments in the chat box supporting the markets work group approach. And so that I bundled those into 2. And then we had a comment from Kelly Hall that says Climate Solutions supports the approach laid out in the draft rules and believes it captures the intended flexibility with short-term purchases being exempt from the coal requirement, while also providing an option for utilities to enter into long-term contracts and still meet the requirement under RCW 19405-030. The way I interpret the language, e-tags are encouraged as an option, but utilities could use other optional data if necessary and appropriate. There's certainly an opportunity to discuss this in the markets work group, but this should not be a reason to delay the rule. Yes. And with that, that kind of summarizes our comments here. Again, the comments are being collected, and Glenn will review the comments after the workshop. But with that, let's move on.
Okay, let's do it. My next sheet is blank. Does this mean we have to end the workshop now? No, let's see, I'll find it somewhere else. I'm just going to switch documents. No, I'm not going to. Hey, I propose we take like a 5-minute break here, Austin, because somehow I'm missing the document I was going to use for this section. And we've been going almost an hour anyway. So how about that? 5 minutes?
That's great.
All right.
Let's take a 5-minute break.
Check the fridge. All right. I bet there is. Well, I am back. I found my little language.
Hi, Glenn. I am back as well, and it appears the guy with the leaf blower outside is back.
That happens to us when we're at the office too, so makes it more like that traditional office experience.
So should we get started?
Sure. It is Rule 320 visible out there? Okay.
It appears that you got a box open, maybe the WebEx box, or something on the side. Otherwise, it is visible. Yeah, that's better.
So does that look pretty good in terms of visibility?
That looks good, yeah.
Okay. So this rule draft would interpret the provision that's in RCW 19-405-040. Has to do with the portion of electricity under the greenhouse gas neutral standard that is within the 80% portion. And the language on that is that for that 80%, the utility needs to use electricity from renewable resources and non-emitting electric generation. And then it does actually say there in an amount equal to 100% of load. It's then that, kind of the next subsection down, it says that up to 20% can be met using alternative compliance options. So that means that at least 80% of this 100% amount needs to be met by using electricity from renewable resources and non-emitting electric generation. And so the discussion that we had in October and the comments in November were about what that meant in kind of a practical way, something that a utility would be able to demonstrate compliance after the fact. And it sort of comes down to how the different ways that a utility might use electricity, and whether that requires some specific use. Like for instance, does the utility, would it need to show that the electricity went from exact, on a real-time basis from specific renewable or non-emitting generating units to specific points within the utility's distribution system, or is it a more general requirement to match load with sources of renewable electricity? One, I think, important point in all this is that it does allow for this, this test is applied over a multi-year period. Generally, these are 4-year periods. There's one little 3-year period out there somewhere. And so what we've come up with here, based on the comments, is a provision that generally allows a utility to meet this requirement by either generating the electricity itself, or to acquire that electricity, purchase it, for instance, in a transaction where both the electricity and the non-power attributes of the electricity are purchased together. So it's purchasing a bundled product. It's not purchasing, say, unspecified power and then in a separate transaction, renewable energy credits. And then another point of discussion about that was, whether they needed to somehow demonstrate that they, brought that power to their load or not. We ended up in the discussion with some, hypotheticals where the source of the electricity might be quite remote. It would be hard to say whether hard to say that they might have actually used that for their own retail service. And so we addressed that point in the second sentence of subsection 1 that would require that if the source is within the Western interconnection, that in itself is sufficient to meet that use electricity test. And if there were some, seems like it's unlikely, but if there were some circumstance where they were identifying a source that's outside the Western interconnection, then the burden is on the utility to prove that it could have delivered that power to the utility's distribution system. And then subsection 2 addresses a situation where utility, did acquire the bundled product, but then elected to sell that electricity to someone other than its retail customers. And what we're proposing to address that situation is that if they are selling, if the power that they are selling in that situation is renewable or non-emitting power, as demonstrated by the fact that they are also transferring the non-power attributes of that electricity, then they can't use those attributes for compliance with the greenhouse gas neutral standard. But if they are buying bundled renewable electricity and selling unspecified electricity, where they are retaining the non-power attributes, and that original purchase or generation still could still be counted toward compliance with the greenhouse gas neutral standard. So I know this is sort of a messy area and one where there are multiple hypotheticals that might come up. But it, anyway, is our effort to try to address the circumstances that we've been presented with so far in discussing the rule. And so that's kind of it for me. I'd be happy to turn it over to questions and comments.
Hi, Glenn. I have received a couple of comments privately, but I believe they're intended for everyone. So if you sent a message recently, can you double check to make sure that you've selected everyone and not commerce energy policy? Because I believe everyone here could benefit from the comments and questions being sent. It seems we have Wendy Gerlitz with her hand raised. I'm not sure if that's because...
Sorry, that was from earlier.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Wendy. And then we have Nash Callaghan, if I'm pronouncing it.
Callahan?
Yes. Actually, Nash, would you like to unmute and post your question, make a comment? If not, I believe Kelly Hall has her hand raised. Kelly, would you like to unmute?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Glenn. I have two comments or questions. The first is on sub 1, and my comment is that it does indicate that a utility is using electricity if it is generating that electricity, and the way we interpret the intent of the policy and the language in 040 is that all retail sales of electricity to customers must be greenhouse gas neutral. So thinking about what happens with line losses and delivery versus actual generation, we would say this needs to be clarified, and that it actually is the electricity that is delivered to load, not just the electricity that is generated from any given resource. And then my second, this is more of a question, I think, but in sub 2, a clarification that when you have a bundled resource and then you unbundled it into, the energy that you're selling is then unspecified electricity. If a utility retains ownership of those non-power attributes, are you viewing that as being eligible for the 80% bundled portion of the requirement under 040 or the unbundled portion?
The idea would be that the electricity would be eligible under the 80% portion, so that I don't think there'd be any question about that. It would also be eligible. I mean, if we're talking about renewables, that it would be the unbundled rec could be used within that 20% portion as an alternative compliance option. But under this language, the electricity that the utility owned before it made that sale of unspecified power, when the attributes were still with the electricity, that electricity could be counted toward that 80% requirement, notwithstanding the fact that the utility then made that unspecified source sale.
Okay, thanks. I think we would have some concerns with that once an attribute is separated from the electricity, that we would consider that an unbundled rec or non-power attribute, and so should not be considered part of that 80% bundled standard.
Okay, thanks.
Then we have a couple of questions in the comment box. The first one is more of a comment that we added the RCW at the bottom, the rule language, and the question of whether we can update the web page to have this document, and we can do that. And that'll be available after today's workshop. Then we had a question from Michelle Patterson that says, can you please provide an example of subsection 2 so that I can better understand the difference?
Okay. An example might be that a utility operates a renewable generating facility, and depending on the hour of the day, or how much electricity is required for its system, for its load, versus how much electricity is being generated by that renewable generating facility. That in some instances, it would generate renewable electricity and have in excess of what it needs for its own load, and so sells the electricity to someone else in the wholesale market. but it would sell it as an unspecified product. It would not be representing that electricity as being from the renewable source, and it would retain the rec. And if it did that, then it would be allowed to use that electricity that it generated that was renewable toward it, the 80% portion of its greenhouse gas neutral target. And then the counter example would be that when it made that sale, it sold it as a renewable product. It transferred the RECs with the electricity. In that case, that electricity could not be counted toward its 80% requirement. So, if there were another Washington utility as the purchaser, then in that case, it could count that electricity toward its renewable requirement, the 80% requirement. So I guess that'd be my example.
Thanks, Glenn. And then we had some comments and questions from Todd Jones. And these questions and comments were in Pacific Core indicated these questions and comments were ones that they would like to have discussed, or that they seconded them, I should say. I'm trying to navigate the chat box here. The first sentence of section 1 could be clarified. The wording, specifically the use of the word or, could be interpreted to mean that ownership of the facility alone demonstrates use of that generation and does not need to retain and retire the RECs in this case. Also, regarding section 1, could you explain the basis of the requirement for a single transaction? Is there a scenario where an entity could acquire the RECs and the power from the same facility but through multiple or separate transactions? Would that be considered an unbundled rec transaction and have to go in the 20% alternative compliance? I wonder if that meets the intent of what was envisioned as an unbundled rec transaction. How does the number of transactions relate to the definition of bundled and unbundled?
Austin, thank you for reading that question. Would you like to just go ahead and answer it for me? I'm just kidding. Generally speaking, like Kelly was saying before, there's a notion here that about the electricity being bundled. In the 20% part, the alternative compliance is referred to as an unbundled rec. It means you kind of need to look around and identify a point at which electricity is bundled as something that would be needed if you're not within that 20% portion. And so the language here would identify the bundled, the point at which the electricity is bundled is when the utility either produces that electricity itself or when it acquires it from someone else. And so when it acquires it, it would need to buy it intact, both the electricity and the attributes. And there is a bit of a parallel to this approach in the Energy Independence Act with the way hydro is characterized there. There's the language about acquiring it in a single transaction. I don't have the specific reference, but I would encourage people to take a look at that and see if it lines up as a kind of a parallel approach to this, if that kind of helps make this approach here in this rule seem consistent or reasonable. And I don't read in this any sort of implication about whether you do or don't have to retire the RECs. We already will have a different rule, and the statute itself also says that all of the renewable resources that are used for compliance, the greenhouse gas neutral standard, have to be verified by the retirement of RECs. And I don't see the need to say that again in this particular section.
Thanks, Glenn. We have Nash, and we have Kelly Hall, and we have Pacificor with their hands raised. I'm not sure if it's like Nash has the ability to use his mic now. I'm not
Let's
sure.
hear from Nash.
Yeah. If you're speaking, Nash, we cannot hear you. It appears your mic is muted. If you're speaking, we still cannot hear you. You might want to try your audio options in WebEx to make sure that your mic's connected and turned on. Volume up.
Technical difficulties. Okay.
So while we wait for Nash, we had John DeVore, if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly, pose the question. So if we have wind farm operations that we own, and a small portion of the power generation is transferred to the landowners for landowner use agreements, and we receive the RECs associated with that generation to either sell or pair to make bucket, quote unquote, bucket 2 energy, the sub 2 remove that capability, and by remove the capability of the bundling, that is.
I'm going to assume that that landowner is not a retail customer of utility. Otherwise it would clearly be you'd be delivering electricity to your retail customer, and that electricity is renewable. I think I may have misremembered how the REC was handled. But if it's okay, so not the retail customer, then if the utility is retaining the REC and delivering unspecified power to the landowner, under this approach, that electricity would still, the utility would have used that electricity and would still be able to count it because it retained the REC and later retired it.
Thanks, Glenn. And then we had a comment from Wendy Gerlitz that said, the Northwest Energy Coalition agrees with Climate Solutions that unbundled RECs can only be used to comply with the 20% alternative compliance. The 80% greenhouse gas neutral standard must be met by bundled RECs. Then we just had a question or comment. Some technical advice here. Susan says, on Windows 10, users need to search for microphone privacy and camera privacy and allow access for the duration of the use and for other applications. For example, this WebEx. Once this WebEx is finished, you can go back and turn off access to the microphone and camera in the privacy settings. Cheers. So maybe that will be of help to those of you who are calling in using Windows 10. Other than that, I only see, I believe Kelly and Pacificor still have their hand raised, but I believe they just didn't unraise their hand. If I'm wrong, you can unraise your hand. Or just unmute, I should say. And we have a question from Ian Hunter.
This is Kelly. Todd asked most of my follow-up questions just on the consistency with the definition of unbundled rec in the statute. So I think Glenn already covered my remaining questions. And I'll just say that, you know, we agree with Todd that I don't think this aligns with the actual definition that is in the RCW.
Ian, would you like to unmute and comment?
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me?
Hi, Ian.
Hey, good morning, Glenn. First, just wanted to thank you for the work and the time that you put into drafting this language and these rules. I think from Snohomish's perspective, we appreciate the balance that was struck in the rules here, and we support the language and the approach to how we're considering the use of electricity from renewable resources. You know, we think it strikes the right balance to say that, you know, acquiring the resource as a bundled product meets the definition of the statute and the definition of what is a bundled or unbundled rec. And so we just wanted to thank you and express our support.
Thank you, Ian.
Tatiana raised her hand. Tatiana, would you like to unmute?
Hi. I just wanted to echo what Ian said. I think this is a difficult area of interpretation, and it does seem like the approach that you've taken in this language is a good approach, and we appreciate it.
Thanks. I'm sorry that Nash is having trouble getting on. I wish we could hear his question or comment.
He just posed his question in the chat box, Glenn. So you wrote, Glenn, does subsection 2 apply only to the 20% alternative compliance option? Is that intended to be sorry, I lost it as we had another comment. Is that intended to be read into these rules? Apologies if this has already been answered. I dropped off the call for a minute.
Okay. And no, it's not. Subsection 2 is not intended to define the circumstance where unbundled recs can be used as an alternative compliance option. This would be to define the circumstances where the utility has used electricity as laid out in the statute that's quoted there below the draft rule language. So this would be anywhere within the 100% requirement, including the portion that can't be covered with alternative compliance options. So that's the purpose of this rule, is to identify or clarify what it takes in order to meet this requirement that the electricity be used. And, you know, we may be kind of wrapping up on this one, I'm not sure, but for those of you who feel like this approach is not consistent with the statute, I really want to encourage you to, when you're doing comments on the draft language here in 3 or 4 weeks, mid-June, you know, we would welcome you to provide alternative language, you know, that you feel like does more specifically address this. You know, or maybe I shouldn't say specifically, but does is consistent with your understanding of the statute. Or, another possibility would be if you feel like this doesn't need to be addressed in rules at all, and have the auditor rely on the statutory language itself. That's another possibility that we certainly consider. So sharpen your pencils and give us some suggestions on different language if you feel like this one isn't within the statute.
Hi, Glenn. I believe we are wrapping up this section as well. We had Cowlitz, Benton, Mason, and Tacoma Power express agreement with Snohomish and PGP. Sarah just messaged me not to forget Nash's comment. And I believe we got to Nash's comment. He had one.
Is this a comment separate from the question, or? Okay.
Oh, not worries.
All right. What's next on our agenda, Austin?
Well, we've covered 300, 310, and 320, correct? And so I have a feeling that we skipped 310.
We did. We skipped 310. And Liz Klump from Bonneville did not say, Glenn, you skipped 310. So that is just terrible. Not that Liz failed to object, but that I did that. I guess when I went and retrieved a new copy of the document, and then I flipped to the end instead of the bit at the beginning. Well, I hope that we can go back and talk some about 310. And so should we do that now? Is that just plowing on better than taking a break?
That sounds good to me, Glenn.
Okay. So 310, I always think this one is the simplest, the fewest number of issues. And that, oh yeah, this, like everybody nods their head when they say, this is how we should do it. And then we get into details, and it's not as simple as people thought it was the first time they thought about it. So the situation that we're dealing with here is verifying that the utility had non-emitting electric generation that it is using to comply with the greenhouse gas neutral standard, or for that matter, with the 100% clean standard that takes effect in 2045. And the reason why we need to address this in some way is that non-emitting electric generation does not have renewable energy credits that go with it. For renewable energy, the way the utility demonstrates compliance is by the retirement of the REC. And that's going to be true whether it's an unbundled REC or whether it's within that 80% portion that we just talked about. It's renewable, there's going to be a REC, it's going to be retired. But for non-emitting generation, there is no REC. And so the discussion that we've had in the past, again, going back to last October, was that for this generation, this type of generation, it would be best to rely on sort of a paper trail of chain of custody. It shows that the from the generator to the utility that's using that for its compliance, that the non-power attributes remained with the electricity through any sort of transfer of ownership that occurred. And that was, as I understand it, the practice that was used before renewable energy credits became kind of the very commonplace way of documenting renewables. These attestations, kind of part of the contracts that demonstrated ownership of the electricity were used. So this is an attestation-based approach. And one thing that I think makes it easier is that, unlike with that no coal requirement, you're not trying to prove a negative. You're just proving that you have clear title to the attributes of that non-emitting electric generation. And you'll see here that in subsection 2, the language there was properly authorized representative. So maybe language like that would be, a more appropriate way of describing it in 300 as well. Comments on the exact term that ought to be used either here or in 300. Probably use the same term in both of those, if at all possible. And the complicating part in this that I've been aware of as we've gone through it is that is addressed in subsection 3. Practically speaking, at least based on the resources that are in existence today, really what we're talking about with in terms of non-emitting electric generation is the portion of BPA's electricity portfolio that comes from the Columbia Generating Station, our only nuclear powered project in the region. And all of its output, is marketed by BPA as part of its resource portfolio. And so we need to develop language that works in terms of BPA's business operations and its contracts that it has with its customers. And in discussing this with BPA, it seemed like they were more comfortable saying that the non-power attributes of the nuclear had not been separated from the electricity itself, rather than saying that those attributes were transferred with the electricity. And so that seemed okay to us as we were considering different ways of phrasing this. From our perspective, it seemed more or less the same statement. So anyway, so subsection 3 is our effort to try to address that specific situation with the nuclear power that's part of BPA's product. So that's what we have here for draft rule to cover non-emitting electric generation. Comments are welcome. And questions.
Then we have a clarifying question from Steve Taylor related to 310 subsection 1. Can you expand on the statement, quote, committed to use the non-power attributes exclusively for the stated compliance and purpose? Is there a special parameter here for non-emitting?
Well, I don't think there's a special one, like that's special to non-emitting resources. As I understand it, with attestations that are made, in contracts, when you get to that final use, where a utility has acquired electricity with the attributes, and then intends to use that as part of compliance, say, for instance, with the Energy Independence Act today, it needs to some way say, not only do I have clear title to those attributes based on the chain of purchases, that got those to me, but now I need to in some way commit that I'm not going to in the future transfer those attributes to somebody else. So they need to make a commitment that they will, for all practical purposes, retire those attributes, by committing not to sell them to somebody else now that they've used them for compliance. Nothing more specific than that. Just here is that they make a commitment not to do that.
So Glenn, this is Steve. Does that somehow, does that kind of dovetail in with the language in 320 on this bundled acquisition-based approach for compliance?
Yeah, it would, right? So if we were under 320, we were using examples that were renewables, but the same could be true with non-emitting electric generation resource. That utility would retain the non-power attributes and commit not to use them for anything other than compliance under 310 subsection 1.
Okay, thank you.
Then we have a comment from Michelle Patterson that subsection 2, the CEO of the utility should also be changed to properly authorized representative. And we have a question from Todd Jones. Is Commerce willing to work with Regis, other program administrators, and market operators to create certificates in Regis for other non-emitting generation, as well as perhaps all generation in the future? The language be added here to account for the possibility that certificates and or all generation tracking are available in the future.
I think we're always open to better and easier methods of making sure that utilities are complying with clean energy requirements. The creation of the REC tracking system, it was just so much better than the alternative of having all these contract files floating around and trying to document that without some sort of centralized system. I mean, it'd be kind of like trying to buy and sell property without there being a county courthouse to record deeds. It just is a huge improvement to do that. It has been for renewables. And, whether there are similar benefits to be had by expanding that centralized record-keeping function to other sources like nuclear power or, even fossil fuel power, to track where those attributes are going. It's a topic that's of interest to us. It's not one that we would, build into a rule ahead of time. If something like that were to develop, we would look at including it in the rule, after we saw what it actually was. So I think that would be kind of our attitude toward it.
Perfect. Thanks, Glenn. Johnny had a clarifying question. Glenn, did you say that BPA has offered alternative language? And if so, could you provide it?
No, I mean, along the way, BPA has offered language. I mean, I would say that we sort of started with the idea in subsection 2 that there be a representation that the attributes were, is that in 2? Yeah, the attestation that the attributes were transferred, and BPA felt like they would rather say it a little bit differently. And so our effort to include the BPA preferred approach is in 3. But you know, I'm not saying that this is exactly what BPA feels is the right language. You know, if Liz wants to pipe up on this one way or the other, that'd be great. It's our effort to try to accommodate what we understood BPA to prefer. We may or may not have hit the mark, but there's not some other alternative that I know of outside of this.
Thanks, Glenn. I believe Liz just raised her hand, and I think we'll take her question or comment given the discussion right now, and then we will get to Tatiana Winger and Lisa.
Okay, so I'm not echoing. Yes, we did ask for language that separated, no, let me clarify. We did ask for language that indicated we did not sell off any non-energy power attributes of the nuclear power separately. We're not aware of a common marketplace for the non-power attributes of nuclear power. So our request was that the bulk of Glenn's language in number 3 is the kind of language we were interested in. So rather than saying our power retained the non-power attributes, we really wanted to acknowledge that, well, we didn't sell off any non-power attributes, partly because we're not aware of any non-power attributes we can sell off. So we're saying we didn't sell them off. Now, my question is the word verifying in sub 3. I think it looks like that applies to the utility. If it applied to Bonneville, we're prepared to state / verify that we didn't sell off the non-power attributes, but I'm not sure how the utility would verify. Thanks.
Sure. And, you know, the way I read that sentence is that the BPA representative verifies that BPA did not separate. And that's what the utility would then rely on. You know, they'd say, look, here's my piece of paper in which BPA authorized representative verified that they didn't separate non-power attributes associated with their nuclear.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Lisa and Tatiana, would one of you like to unmute?
Tatiana, why don't you go first? Because mine is just more of a question.
Okay, sounds good. Well, my question was really actually what Liz just asked around that language in subsection 3 that requires a verification. And we had read it, I think it's just depends on how you read it. We thought that it meant that the utility would verify the BPA, and we weren't sure how we would do that. So I think you clarified, Glenn, that it would be BPA doing that verification. Is that right?
Yeah. You know, okay. If somebody wants to rearrange the words in the sentence, feel free. But you know, the way I read it is it's a representation of BPA stating and verifying.
Okay, great. That's my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Glenn, it's Lisa. And this is just, I guess, more of a curiosity or question, maybe teed up a little bit by Todd Jones' comment about, I think, expansion of what Regis would track potentially. And you had mentioned, you know, that for non-emitting is electric generation that doesn't generate a rec. And it got me thinking about renewable hydrogen, and as defined in CETA, it is a renewable. If it were producing, let's say we're taking renewable hydrogen, it's going in a fuel cell, is producing electricity. And I believe in that case, it would be considered a renewable source, but it wouldn't, at this point in time, there's no way to really generate a rec off renewable hydrogen that I'm aware of. So to me, it was just kind of an example of, you know, we need to keep our minds open to new sources of renewable energy that may be coming in the future, and trying to make sure that we have language that really is technology neutral. Because right now, I would think that something like renewable hydrogen from a fuel cell would probably end up falling in this category, even though it's defined as a renewable. I don't know.
I'm
just musing.
I'm confused about why that wouldn't be a renewable resource. I mean, if it's...
I think it would be, but I think I heard you say that it would, if it doesn't generate, but a renewable generates a rec, and I guess that what caught me up on that is I could be totally wrong, but I don't think currently there's a way to generate a rec for renewable hydrogen.
Well, that's news to me, so I don't, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's not consistent with my understanding of how renewable energy is tracked. I don't know why you couldn't get a rec from a generating facility that uses renewable hydrogen.
Yeah, we'll just have to pursue that a little bit more. I haven't heard of that type of rec. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, Glenn, I am checking here to see if we've missed anything. We had a comment from Susan that if people are commenting in the chat box or vocally, can you state what group you're from, such as a public utility district or an organization or a concerned citizen? Susan is a concerned citizen. Then we had a comment from Dave Arborough on behalf of Energy Northwest. I was reading the quote verifying and quote the way Glenn just interpreted, and I think that is correct approach for reasons stated by Liz and Tatiana. Now we still have hands raised for Liz, and we've had a hand raised for Pacific Core as well. And Tom Barnard just raised his hand. So I'm not sure. Liz has unraised her hand. Pacific Core has had his hand raised for some time now. Feel free to unmute. If not, let's go to Tom.
Thanks, Tom Barnard, State Auditor's Office, Consumer-Owned Utility Auditor. As I was looking at too, I just want to throw out a comment. that in I-937 work we've done in the past, we've looked at, whether or not incremental hydro non-power attributes that aren't registered in Regis, how has a utility ensured it did not sell the non-power attributes. And so we asked a battery of questions and got into it, and it got really complicated. But, at the end of the day, there are certain mechanisms utility use to sell power, and do those mechanisms include any ability to include the non-power attributes or exclusively sell just non-power attributes? We didn't see much of anything, but through that questioning, we were able to get some comfort around the fact that that wasn't happening, so that what they were claiming was a bundled product. And so, I think this does fine. And we've gone as far as to request of utilities to reach out to those supplying electricity to state that, the fuel they're using conforms with the requirements as an eligible renewable resource under the Act. So there's various ways we can approach the work just to get some attestation. And I just want to put that out there. There's a couple of ways you can look at it that we've looked at in the past that maybe have helped here. That I just want to provide that feedback.
Thanks, Tom. Do you think any of that range of approaches needs to be incorporated into the rule itself, or is that more appropriately left to kind of the interaction between the auditor and the utility?
I think auditor and utility. I think I just wanted to mention it so it was on people's radar screen how we might want to look at it, how they might want to document it, or what we might be asking when we come in to look at something like this, just so that it isn't a big surprise and that type of thing. So I'm not seeing a real need to revise rules here, but I did want to provide some context from our perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Glenn, we don't have any other comments in the chat box, and it appears no one has their hand raised.
I only saw beginning of Dave Warren's comment.
Yeah, so Dave Warren, on behalf of Renewable Hydrogen Alliance and Douglas PUD, he states that he agrees with Lisa Rennie and that the rule should anticipate renewable hydrogen and other technologies and fuels in a manner that does not necessarily require creation or retirement, rather attestation that it is a renewable resource and there is not double counting of that resource. Generated from storage that is charged by a renewable resource is an area that we will need to address.
Okay. So I both for Dave and again for Lisa, I think you're going to need to educate me some on what there is about generation from renewable hydrogen that requires some treatment other than the use of a REC. This is a new perspective for me. I'm not saying we do it on this call right here, but I just wanted to let you know that.
Well, Glenn will give a moment for people. Oh, maybe Lisa was unmuted and wanted to comment.
Oh, I was just going to say thanks, Glenn. We'd love to chat with you more about it. I think the whole area of renewable fuels is very interesting and exciting, but they sometimes will have dual purposes. One is a renewable fuel, one is a source for production of electricity. So yeah, I think there's plenty to talk about. So thank you for your offer.
All right, good.
Well,
what's next, Austin?
Next on the agenda is question time about other draft rules. And so by other draft rules, when we wrote this, I believe we were referring to the other rules in the first discussion packet posted on the Commerce webpage that we haven't gotten to yet. Do you have any other parameters around the conversation, Glenn?
Well, I do want to scope this a little bit by saying that we intend with our next workshop to address the reporting rules that are, more at the beginning of that overall package of rules. So I don't, it's probably best not to use our time today discussing those. But if there were other rules that people, have been looking at and have questions about, that so far we haven't teed up for a workshop yet. We could spend a little bit of time on that right now if there's interest in doing that.
We had Tatiana raise her hand, and I believe we had someone else raise their hand as well. Tatiana, why don't you go first?
All right. Thanks. So I know you said that you'd address the reporting rule in another workshop, and I think we like that idea. And I think that would probably be when we get to the idea of what utilities need to do prior to 2030 and whether there's any compliance demonstration related to that time period. And if not, then I think we would just like to have the opportunity at some point to cover that issue. I assume it would be in reporting because that's where that interim compliance report is mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's right too. And can people see on the screen now the reporting title?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, I think that when we talk about 040, that we could talk then about what the utility needs to do before 2030 with respect to those two periods that are covered by the first two clean energy implementation plans.
Okay. And then I think the other section of rules that I've heard from PGP members on is 194-40-340, which is the acquisition of new resources. And at least how we're reading that seems to have in that subsection 1 language sort of a prohibition on new gas. I mean, I think the 2025 standard is already a prohibition on coal, and maybe that's already addressed in other areas of the law. But I think that's how we've read it. And we have questions about that and kind of the statutory basis. And then it also seems to indicate that, utilities could not acquire new non-emitting electric generation, which I think, as a clear example that we have in front of us is nuclear. So kind of another question related to that section. So I don't know if you were planning to have a workshop on that, but that is an area that we definitely have questions about.
Okay. Yeah, and so, I mean, just real briefly, the provision that we're trying to kind of pull out of the statute and be able to address it more directly is in 040 subsection 6. And I don't have the language right in front of me, but it's a a requirement that the utility rely on renewable resources and storage, kind of, if at all possible. I know it doesn't say that exactly, but so the approach here was to set out how the utility could, how we could implement that. So, generally speaking, new fossil, new non-emitting, both things that are not either renewable or storage wouldn't be permitted unless it's necessary to comply with the targets. And then, it goes from there about kind of how a utility would establish that fact, that they would use their integrated resource plan to do it. It would be independent opinion reached on that. All of that in mind to be able to show the auditor that, in fact, that acquisition did not violate that provision in subsection 6. And I think to discuss that further in another workshop would make sense because there's a lot of stuff there that probably needs to be discussed, but that's the general thought about that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think we would love a chance to talk about that in a workshop.
Yeah.
More than right now.
Let's do it. Let's put that one on the list.
Okay. Shop that work.
All right. Well, we have Wendy Gerlitz with her hand raised. Wendy, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, thanks. I just had a question, Glenn. I didn't see anything in this compliance section related to 040 subsection 8, which is the section that talks about ensuring that customers are benefiting, all customers are benefiting from the transition to clean energy and the equitable distribution language. And I'm wondering what your intent is for dealing with the compliance of that subsection.
Yeah, we do not have a draft of language to kind of put any more specifics or interpretation on 0408. If stakeholders have, believe that's important that we do that, we should get that proposals, in front of us and other stakeholders. And there is within the compliance rule, the reporting rule, 040, rule section 040, some language there about how a utility would show, what it had accomplished with respect to the requirements of 048. But we, at this point, don't have any rule language that would, more specifically interpret the requirements of that section.
Okay, I think, in reading it, we were pretty convinced that there was a compliance implication to the language that's there. So we'll try to work with other stakeholders to get some proposals into you on that.
Okay, good. And generally speaking, I would say that, sometimes there's a provision in the statute that, compliance, there's no doubt about whether it's a compliance requirement or not, but it may not need a rule because it may stand on its own without any further interpretation. But it may be that there needs to be a demonstration of compliance, such as the report. then there can be other provisions where statute maybe was not so clear about exactly what it takes to meet that requirement, and a rule may be helpful in in clarifying and establishing more specifically what it means to comply. So that would be the context in which we would decide whether a rule is helpful or not for that particular provision.
I believe Tom raised, now unraised it, so maybe you covered his comment. And
No, actually, if I could, Tom Barnard again. Hey, Glenn, I'm looking at 340 here, and I see independent evaluator must confirm, and I'm not sure what can you explain a little bit about what your vision is for an independent evaluator? What does that mean? It's kind of a vague term to me, and I'm not sure what I would, as an auditor, what I would expect to see if I was to verify an independent auditor did some work.
Yeah, and at this point, I don't have anything more specific than what's stated in that sentence.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was just.
No, it's fine. I mean, it's that they be qualified to perform electric resource evaluations, that they not be affiliated with the utility or have participated in the utility's resource planning activities. So I'm expecting that we'll get comments about the merits of that particular provision, and to have comments about how we ensure that the evaluator is independent would certainly be welcome as well.
Thank you.
And we have Dave Arborough, if I'm pronouncing your last name correct. Dave, would you like to unmute?
I'll try. I hope you can hear me. I think I'm just following. Hi, Glenn. Thanks for doing these. These are actually kind of helpful. I'm sort of following up, I think, on Tatiana's comment or question, and Tom's as well. On behalf of Energy Northwest, had some concern about the way 340 is drafted, and it appears to exceed what the statute requires, particularly in terms of the independent evaluator for a consumer-owned utility. So probably hear more about that in our comments that we submit in writing, but wanted to put that on the record now as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Dave.
While you pull up the language, Glenn, we had a question from Liz, and the question is Ecology or Commerce preparing to get storage projects to report their related greenhouse gas emissions if the storage isn't charged by renewable power?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, generally speaking, we measure emissions at the point of generation, attribute emissions to consumption, and the storage is, assuming this is in the transmission or distribution system, storage is in between there, and wouldn't necessarily affect either the emissions that occur at the point of generation or the attribution of those emissions to when the electricity is consumed. So it certainly has not been on our list of things that we needed to account for. If there is something there that we need to address, then we should probably get some feedback on that and some more specifics about what the what the situation is there.
All right, thanks, Glenn. I believe Wendy Gerlitz has her hand raised.
I'm just really bad at putting my hand back down. Sorry.
It happens. You too. Just have someone else raise their hand. We had Kelly Hall and raise her hand.
Hey, Glenn, related to Liz's question, I mean, I think that brings up a really good question on storage. And with regards to compliance, I do think there's a little, that it needs to be clarified, you know, how a resource is considered with regards to the greenhouse gas neutral standard or the 100% clean standard from a compliance standpoint. When you are using storage, how you require that utilities identify what resource that storage is actually charged with. So both on I think Liz was really referring to the greenhouse gas content. And my question is much more around documenting which resource that comes from when it comes from storage.
And so, Kelly, are you thinking that there should be a rule that covers that kind of accounting for what happens as a result of electricity being stored and used?
Yeah, I think there should be clarification. You know, I don't know if it's a separate rule or just within, I think, I don't know which section, but clarifying that if a resource comes from storage, the utility also needs to demonstrate which resource ultimately charged storage. And I guess just kind of a question, Glenn, what do utilities currently do with regards to our fuel mix disclosure if they are using storage? How is that currently accounted for?
Well, so it's not, because storage, you know, is not actually a source of energy. Mm-hmm. It can be a source of capacity. It's something that actually consumes energy rather than supplying energy. And so for fuel mix, utility identifies the actual sources, you know, the generating units that are used to serve their customers and their unspecified sources. And then, you know, match that with their retail load. Doing that, you know, any kind of storage that happens in between those two just, you know, it doesn't show up.
Okay. Right. So I guess my question is just then with the new definition of non-emitting electric generation, whether storage fits into that definition or whether it's actually the resource that is charging the battery or other form of storage.
Yeah, and so my understanding would be the latter. If there are other views on that, I'll be interested in hearing them. But you know, the way I think of storage is that it's not a renewable resource. It's not a non-emitting resource. It's a device that allows electric energy to be stored for use at a different time. And so again, that we'd be looking at the generating units and the consumption, but not the storage doesn't affect that in between. But again, you know, this is a new concept and one I'd be interested in hearing other people's views on.
Glenn, this is Tanya. I forwarded you a link which actually looks at study that looked at the implementation of storage in the U.S. has actually increased CO2 emissions. To the speaker's point, I know that this has been a big issue in California and one that they've been trying to get ahead of addressing. So I did put that link in chat.
All right, well, thank you. So we may be looking at a storage rule, or at least the discussion of the storage rule, to add to our list of things to do under this.
So Glenn, we have a few other comments here in the chat box that I want to get to. But I want to make sure I'm not forgetting any here. Tatiana mentioned that at our last workshop, we discussed that we would talk about methodologies for energy efficiency and demand response. She asked, is that still on the list for a future workshop as well? And that is a yes, we do plan on having that in a future workshop. We have a comment from Susan. She writes, as a citizen parent, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that the Washington State PTA is concerned about the adverse health effects of climate change on our children. We support renewable, sustainable energy and technologies and legislation that uses market forces, incentives, and regulations to address the effects of climate change. And then she references Resolution 1128, mitigating the health effects of climate change, and gave us a link to that. Thank you, Susan. I don't know, Glenn, if you have anything to comment there.
No, just thank you for the comment. I appreciate that. Lisa Rennie wrote that Tacoma Power supports a further opportunity to discuss the prohibition for new non-emitting resources and the draft rules. This language could preclude the development of new technologies, specifically in the renewable fuel development space. So we have just on that point, and we really should tee this up for another workshop. I can tell from the discussion on it, but the language that we're referring to be just as specific as possible is in 19.405.040, subsection 6A. At the second sentence there, it says, in making new investments, an electric utility must, to the maximum extent feasible. And then if we skip to the third sub point there, it must, to the maximum extent feasible, in the acquisition of new resources, rely on renewable resources and energy storage, insofar as that is consistent with basically the requirement to meet your targets. So that's the language that we're trying to some way kind of unbury. It's really kind of obscure in there, but it is, it's an actual requirement. It says the utility must do this. We're trying to pull it out, understand it, and make it so that it's something that the auditor can either say, yes, you did comply, or no, you didn't comply, in a predictable way. So that's the task that's in front of us as a group.
Thanks, Glenn. And then the only other comment that I'm seeing that I haven't touched on is from Dave Warren, and it seems to be addressed to Rob, and I cannot interpret whether we need to walk through this comment or not. Dave, feel free to jump on the line and walk through your comment if it wasn't intended to be walked through with the group. Other than that, we don't have anyone else in the comment box.
Can you hear me, Austin? This is Dave Warren. Can you hear me?
Hey, Dave. Yes, we can hear you.
Tyler.
Hey, Dave.
Okay. Yeah, rather than read through my comment, I will circle back to Glenn saying perhaps we need a workshop on storage. My comment went to the point when your storage, whether it's renewable hydrogen or battery storage or pump storage, is charged, shall we say, by renewable energy. In essence, you're converting that variable renewable energy to renewable capacity. And in that loss of conversion, that's a cost rather than a value. And I agree that if you have fossil generation charging storage, your greenhouse gas emissions are going up. But if you have renewable energy charging that, you go down and you're turning that variable energy into capacity. So I think we'd really appreciate, on behalf of both my pump storage client and renewable hydrogen, having a separate discussion and workshop, Glenn, on storage and how we value that in those new resource requirements. That's all. Thanks.
Okay. Well, it does seem like this is a topic that we ought to add to our list.
And then we have Katie Ware with her hand raised.
Hi, Glenn. This is Katie Ware from Renewable Northwest. Sorry to pivot topics. Hello. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. I just wanted to get in a quick question about, just curious how Commerce interprets the need to add enforcement to the draft rules, and whether you intend to revise the compliance section or maybe create a new section. Just curious your thinking as it stands now on enforcement. Thank you.
Sure. And, we don't anticipate having anything in the rules about enforcement. Our understanding of the kind of the way the different agencies work on this is that while we write rules to interpret statute and collect reports, the verification of compliance is performed by the auditor, and to the extent there is any need for enforcement, that would come through the Attorney General's office. So that's our, kind of our perspective on it. It's the same kind of set of relationships that exist under the Energy Independence Act, and we would expect that, as far as we can tell, that same arrangement is carried over to CETA.
Glenn, Tom Barnard, I concur with you. AG is responsible for enforcement, so that's the way we see the world too.
Thank you, Tom, Katie, and Glenn. Kelly Hall has her hand raised. Not sure if she has a question or comment.
Sorry, that was just left.
All right, no worries. We have no other comments in the comment box, and I don't see anyone else with their hand raised at this time, Glenn.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we had that chance to do just, a little bit of open mic, other rules that were of interest or whatever, because it certainly helped me identify storage as one that we need to add to. And, I was pretty sure that that rule about, acquiring new fossil fuel or non-renewable, was going to need to be a workshop topic. And you confirmed my prior thoughts on that. So we will plan on scheduling that for future workshop discussion. And anyway, so overall, I want to thank everybody for your engagement today. It was, for us, for me at least, very productive, and I hope it wasn't too bad for you either. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.